It's an amazing day. Hey, this is Zach Edwards with another Adventure Box podcast, and we are so excited to get you started in this because today we're talking about one of my most favorite times in African history. Now, it spans over a thousand years or so, but, well, actually probably over 2,000 years, 1,000 years, 1,300 years, 1,500 years, somewhere around there. But anyways, we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about the Ghana Empire, which we started talking about the last time. Then we're going to go into the Mali Empire. And then we're going to the, what was after that? The Songhai Empire. So these are all of Western Africa. And what's amazing about this is how the history of the world was started here. Now, I'm not saying prehistoric times. I'm saying something that enveloped the United States, all of the Americas, most of other countries. Yes, well, the Western was more of the Europe and Middle East, and there's also Asia. So yeah, basically the whole entire world, because of what? Trade. Trade is what spanned it, and one specific trade that people talk about nonstop, which is slavery. And we're going to go through the whole thing as it was shown in Western Africa. Now, the only reason why I focus a lot on slavery is because it is a hot topic right now in politics, in life. We're talking about reparations to different people. And while I am very sorry for what happened in the past, reparations have never actually solved an issue. So reparations, I guess, in certain ways. Giving money to someone has never solved an issue. Throwing money at the issue never solved it. Most of the people that are here these days have never experienced the things that people back then experienced. Now, when it comes to bigotry and things like that, yes, they have. They completely have in certain parts of life. But when it comes to the things experiencing slavery, none of us at all have experienced slavery, except those that are sold into slavery that is actually today. There are actual slaves today. More people that you never see, though. So slavery, when it was ended, a lot of times it was ended in certain countries, but not in other areas. And when they were stopped in those areas, they became part of the black market. And there are people coming over the border that are being sold into slavery. Well, child labor or other types of slavery we won't talk about in this podcast. But we do actually have a good part of this. We're talking about slavery because it started, and it didn't start in Africa, but it started a global expansion because of what was happening in Africa. And this, we're going to give you, again, the origins of where it came from. But that's not the only thing that has to do with Africa. Africa was the hub of advancements. It was the major place of all trade. It was the major place of knowledge, universities, and such. So that is a lot to say. That is a lot to claim, but we're going to go through it today. That's right. As we talk about, again, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, which took over for Ghana, the Songhai, which took over for the Mali Empire, and so forth. We're not going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about more on the East Coast, I think next week. And also, later today, we're also going to be pushing it a little bit of Northern Africa, around the Mediterranean, because that was completely different than everywhere else that you'd find. It's very quite interesting. So let's get going. Okay, so the first stuff that we're going to be talking about is the Ghana Empire. So last time we mentioned, let's do it over here. Last time we mentioned the Ghana Empire, how it was this small nation or small empire over here. Now, small in the sense that this is all of Africa, and this is the Ghana Empire. It's smaller. So Western Africa, basically in the center of it, on the edge of the Niger River. Now, why was it on the edge of the Niger River? Of course, people that settled in these times wanted to make sure they had water. Water was life. And so, as part of the advancements of as I said, the advancements of these people, of anyone in the ancient times, was based on their survival. So their advancements was to stay on the rivers. Now there's two different rivers. There is one here and one of the Niger River coming out here. So they were on the meeting point of both of these rivers, which allowed for trade and survival. Now, let's go from the survival instinct. So everyone has a survival instinct. Our survival instinct at this time is more of staying warm, finding food. Wait a second, that sounds primitive. Finding shelter. Hey, look at that. Finding, I guess I already said warmth. Wow, that is actually the same survival instincts that were back then. But now what would we look for? We as like Americans, or basically anyone in the world these days, are looking for entertainment, opportunity. Sorry, wow, I got something stuck in my throat. But back then, they made their own opportunity. When somebody settled in a certain area, a tribe or a culture, they settled in a certain area. They made their own agriculture. They made their own herds and livestock. They domesticated these. They made them their own. There was no need to actually trade with someone else. But then they realized, hey, you know what? What would be more efficient? If I do really well at, I grow sheep very well. You grow cows very well. Or say you grow a crop like wheat really well. What if I did the sheep and I traded you the sheep for your crops? Would you trade those? So then it became these two tribes would start to sell to each other, or even, I guess it started inside the tribes first, but then it started outside, and then it started outside the tribes, where people were trying to get more food from outside of their influence. Because, tell you what, I love gardening, but I'm not the best at it. I can grow onions like nobody's business. But I can't grow tomatoes for some reason. My soil will not do very well with tomatoes, and I have too many weeds. Onions, doesn't matter the weeds. They grow and they grow and they grow. So forth. When it comes to tomatoes, they need a certain amount of certain type of soil, certain type of care, and you have to keep all the weeds away, because if the weeds grow up before the tomato plant grows up, you lost your tomato plant. You can't find it. So they started to trade from within their own culture or in the same tribe to outside of their tribes and started trading. Well, then all of a sudden, traders from far off lands would come and trade with you. And you're like, oh, great. You have salt. You have gold. Great. I want that. That's what I want. And so then they started trading those things. What was amazing about this part is that you didn't have to focus on every single piece of survival. You had to focus on what you were best at. So then the survival tactic, the advancements became, hey, I'm great at this. I'm going to perfect this one plant or this one commodity. And you perfect that other one. And I won't even worry about that because we're going to trade. Because you're not going to get sheep and I'm not going to get wheat anywhere else. So let's trade them. So then they started trading from far off lands. Sorry. Then what happened? Well, those from Asia decided, hey, let's create what we called the Silk Road. Now, this did not go very far. It went from basically Asia to a little bit into Europe and a little bit into Africa. That's all it went. It was a fairly, with understanding trade and the trade that happened all around the world, there was only a certain amount that was happening. And the Silk Road only got the road up to a certain point, and then the Europeans would have to trade at places like Constantinople. So they would trade in that one city and then bring it back to their other places. The traders didn't usually have to go all that far. They went into those cities, sold their goods there, and then they went home for the rest of it. And then it started becoming more complex. There were different trade routes that came out. There were different societies that wanted to trade with each other. They didn't want to use traders, or maybe the traders came in and took over for you. So now you could focus on what you did best. You focused on your sheep. Your competitor, or your the person you're trading with, your customer, they do great with wheat. What they both don't do very well at is getting it from one point to the other. But then you had people of trade. These traders, and not traders to a nation, traders, Trader. So traders would come in and transport one good to another place and sell that good. And then they got very complex where they'd go to one area. This is village A, and they'd gather up all the different products, commodities that they could put together. Now they get all of these commodities together, selling the stuff that they brought in, knowing that this commodity is what this other one wants. So they go off to this other one and they would trade that as well. Maybe they would trade it for goods, a certain amount of goods. Maybe they trade it for gold. And so they're like, hey, I can gather all this gold up and I could gather this next supply that this one civilization does really well. I'm going to sell it to this other place. All the time, every time they're trading up. They're trading a penny for a nickel, and then a nickel for a dime, and then a dime for a quarter. And here's the big thing, is that there was never a currency during these trading. There was commodities. Commodities are basically amounts of a product that you can sell on a market. So what is a market? A market is basically any kind of organization where one group sells to another group any one of the commodities. This is why you have commodities and you have trade. Now, what was gold for? Well, gold, you would think, oh, that's a currency. Well, no, it doesn't have to be. It could be jewelry. It could be artistry. It could be a lot of different things. So gold was still used, not as coins. There were no coins at this time. There was gold dust. There was gold nuggets. There were jewelry. There were coins. There were things that they made, but they were more ornamental than they were a currency at this time. So people would trade for all these different things. The traders were the ones that were the middleman. They were the ones taking the supplies from one place to the next. They're the ones that you would see in the Sahara Desert with camels full of different merchandise. Those were the traders. They did not usually call one location home, except they did have a base location, but they lived on the road, constantly gathering these things, and usually they worked for another person, another organization, which they brought the goods back and forth from these things, and then they came back to the home base and reported back and provided that home base with a certain cut of that money, and the trader would collect the rest of it. And so the trade in nations became so complex. It was not anymore the technology of survival. It was now the technology of efficiency and trade. So a city or a group or a tribe was now focused on, this is what we create, and we want to sell it to somebody else and get their commodity that they like and bring it here. So we don't have to produce that because it's really hard for us to produce that one thing. So now let's go to Ghana. Ghana was, oh, and let me just say, this was not just in Africa. I have a picture, if you're listening to the podcast, of Africa, Western Africa, and some of the trade routes that were there. And then the green is the Ghana Empire. Here's the thing. Trade was essential, but it was not just in Africa. It was throughout the whole known world. Europe, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Now, interesting enough, who was in the middle of all that? You have Asia far to the east. You have Europe in the northwest. You have Africa in the southwest. Who was smack dab in the middle? The Middle East. Okay. Why is that significant? Because the Middle East is some of the biggest traders when it comes to any commodity sold within the world. Why was that important? Okay. Think of it this way. What happened just before the Crusades? During the Crusades, it was the Christians from Europe trying to come down and find a route basically back to Jerusalem. So their Christian followers could follow the trade route back to Jerusalem. At the same time, the Muslims took over took over all of the Middle East, including trying to take over Israel and so forth, Jerusalem. Now, with the traders being such a the biggest middleman, now there wasn't just Muslim traders. There was Jewish traders, there was Christian traders, but they were smack dab in the middle. So what happens when Muhammad takes over? So when Muhammad started to develop his following, then all of a sudden it grew into this bigger following. They call them caliphates. These are basically the groups that took over certain locations, areas. There's the Ottoman Empire, which again was the precursor of more of the ship transportation and the exploration by ship. It was the Muslim traders that would actually lock down certain areas that the other traders could not get through unless they paid bribes, they paid for other things, or they converted to their religion. Now, let's go back to Ghana. What was happening in Ghana? Who was Ghana? Ghana was filled of a civilization of African descent. These were all African religions, African cultures, and so forth. Some were the Bantu, who focused more on the south. Some were of other groups, especially those that came out of the Green Sahara. They focused on these different areas for survival. Now they had trade. Who were the traders that came into the area? Well, it was the Muslim traders. What did Muslim traders bring with them? What was the commodity that they found out that those on the West really wanted or really needed, even if they didn't know that they actually needed it? It was the slave trade. We were talking about this earlier. So the Muslim traders took those that they took in war, or those that they took on raids. Like when they took over Constantinople and made it Istanbul, there were so many slaves that came out of there. When the Crusades happened, there were so many slaves that came out of there as well. Now, don't get me wrong. The Christians also took slaves. The Asians also took slaves. And I'm not focusing on any one nation. Middle East, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And so the Muslim traders were in the middle. They controlled basically the routes to both Africa, especially when they took over Egypt, up to the north when they took over Istanbul, Constantinople, which became Istanbul. And when they took over basically those, the Asian traders had a hard time getting through because they were shut off. So that's why the Middle East became the Middle East, because of money and power. And that's basically what it became. It wasn't just on religion, because there's a lot of different sects of the religion as well. So, but a lot of it became from power and money, which is a lot of the other empires as well. Going back to Ghana, these traders came in, they found out, hey, okay, this is what you need. Okay, write that down. This is what you want. Write that down. And this is what you're willing to supply. Write that down. Then they found the places that would supply those things, brought them into Ghana, and Ghana said, great, here, we'll trade you these things. The trader said, perfect. And they moved off to another place, and they traded those commodities to that location. Okay, now that we got trade down, trade understood. The culture at this time was based a lot off of trade. So what happened to Ghana? Now, the traders came in and started establishing a location within the Ghana Empire. And they were fully accepted by the Ghana Empire because they were bringing in commodities that they really wanted and needed, and taking away or selling commodities that they made plenty of. So they were very happy to have those traders come in. And again, not just the Muslim traders, but there were still Christian traders that came through, some Asian traders that came through, and of course African traders, because they're in the area. What happened at that time? Well, okay, so that area that had the Muslim traders, they didn't make you convert in order to trade with them. They actually had rules against doing that, to making someone have to trade for that. But they made it very much the easiest thing ever, and made it very difficult for those that did not convert. So those that converted, easy trading, because you understood their language, their contracts were Sharia law, and also the culture was a lot the same. And they wined and dined you as well because they were traders. Didn't matter if they were Muslim, Christian, whatnot. But all those other traders and the people in the market, they started to convert to Islam. So this large population of Islam decided that the royalty in Ghana weren't representing them. So they were different faiths. The royalty, they didn't trade. They ran the trade routes that were allowed to come in and such. They did a lot of the regulations and other things, but they didn't really convert. So what happened? Well, the empire started to fall apart based around trade and such. This brought in the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire was actually run by Islamic leaders. And so the Mali Empire was this vast empire, much larger than the Ghana Empire, almost twice the size, that worked with all of these trade routes. And why did they work with the trade routes? Because they wanted the money to come in. They also became very influential in spreading the word of Islam. So places like Timbuktu, you had universities based on Muslim advancements. Now, the Muslim culture was actually very advanced. Because of trade, they also traded what? Culture and knowledge. And then they brought it back to places like Timbuktu, where they had these universities and libraries where they would store all this knowledge. Now, with storing all this knowledge, it means that more people can go to this knowledge, learn from that knowledge, and make their own knowledge, like adding on to it, growing the understanding. The advancements began to expand quite drastically, quickly, throughout Western Africa. Now, the same thing was happening up in Europe, but now we're talking about Africa. So we had all these traders coming in. One person at the very peak of the Mali Empire needs to be talked about. Whenever someone talks about the Mali Empire and the economic and the expansion and even the culture of it, they need to talk about one person. This one person is a man by the name of Mansa Musa. Now, if you know Historical Conquest, you've been playing a while, you've seen his card multiple times. This is Mansa Musa. If you have the YouTube channel, you can see that there is a manuscript that was written by Islamic traders, scholars. Whoever wrote this, I actually don't know who wrote this, but they were mapping out the Mali Empire and its great expanse. So they wrote a lot about it in Arabic. Oh, and so also with the traders, if you became Muslim, you also were able to speak their language. Not that it happened automatically, but you studied to learn their language. And so all these different things made it, like, why not convert? Now, you have people like that are Jewish, that are culturally Jewish and religiously Jewish. Two very separate things. Someone might say, I'm Jewish, but they don't believe anything that the Jewish people stand for. And then, of course, there's all different sects within the Jewish faith. Muslims are the same way. You have Muslims that are culturally Muslim in the sense of, like, Africa. A lot of these places, they didn't have to believe the faith. They just had to learn and live by Sharia law, learn Arabic, learn the cultures, those type of things. Now, in the law as well, you had to do the 5 prayers. Now, I don't know how much that was enforced back then. Again, they're trying to bring more people in, and it was more of a cultural thing to a lot of people in Africa, more than a religious thing at the time. So I can't exactly say because none of us are here, and there's not much writings when it comes to that. But what we can say, Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim. He very much believed in the teachings of Islam and Muhammad. So one time, let me just show this. One reason why you need to know him is that he is literally the richest man in history. I'm not just saying in Africa. I'm saying in the entire world. You put Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk, and they still earn pittance to Mansa Musa. Why was that? Because he controlled and owned the Mali Empire, which was basically all the gold mines that they've dug. And I'll show you just how much gold that was. Okay, so his story, the part that you need to learn about, is all about gold. Now, some would say that he was very generous. And he probably was. He was probably very generous. But he was not dumb. Now, what happens when you introduce a ton of, let's say, the U.S. economy? What happens when you introduce a ton of money into the system and don't have goods to match it? Well, if you just throw money into a system, like print money, what happens? Inflation skyrockets. Actually, I should say, yeah, it goes to space. It skyrockets. When COVID happened, there was a huge influx of money. Trump did it initially because we locked people down. But then Biden continued it multiple times, even after people were still were going back to work. What happened when all this money was injected into the system and we weren't adding any more goods to be sold with that, or more population? No, we were injecting it into the system. What happened to inflation? Let me think. When Trump left office, he was at a 1.25 inflation rate. When Biden came into the office, within 18 months, I think it was at 9.8%. That was the inflation rate. And why? Again, they had just injected all of this money into the economy. Now, why do I talk to you about inflation? Because Mansa Musa, again, very highly intelligent. As a ruler, you are trained by the best. Because of the universities and the libraries that are there, very knowledgeable. So he was no idiot. Now, a man that comes in and injects money into a system has two things. One, they might be dumb, which they're not, and neither was the U.S. government, or ignorant, I should say. Or two, it's planned. Now, planned, it does not have to be diabolical in the sense of throwing over the nation. Some people might say it. But at the same time, it could easily be, well, politically, we need to be able to be loved by everyone, so we're going to give them free money. And that happens all the time in the U.S. I mean, politics is all about money. Sadly, the solutions are not money, but we throw money at like everything. So what happened with Mansa Musa? Okay, I've been going on long enough. What happened with Mansa Musa? Mansa Musa was the richest man in the world in all of history. So what happened? He had a, have you ever heard of a Hajj? A Hajj is a pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, during that pilgrimage to Mecca, which is on the west side central of Saudi Arabia, basically on the other side of the Red Sea from Egypt, there is a city there that Muhammad came from, basically where he says he got his vision from. And so Muslims take pilgrimages there every year, those that can. I don't know what the rules are on this, but one of the rules that I do know about is that you're supposed to be generous during this pilgrimage. You're basically giving your devotion to God, and you're going to show that you love your neighbor by being generous to them. Well, so Mansa Musa, very wealthy, decides, I'm going to be very generous. But I'm going to be very generous in certain places. Cairo, Egypt. So he comes with 24,000 pounds of gold. 1 ounce of gold? Oh, I should have looked this up beforehand. But it's quite interesting. Okay, what is 1 ounce of gold? What is 1 ounce of gold worth today? 1 ounce of gold is worth $2,686.60. That's an ounce. There's 16 ounces in a pound. So what is, let's see, what is 1 pound of gold worth today? $22,372. A lot of people make that money every year, survive on that amount of money. That's for 1 pound. Okay, so he took 24,000 pounds of gold into Egypt and Cairo and distributed the gold in the form of gold dust, gold bars, gold nuggets, and such. He had so many gold mines, creating such a plethora of gold. That was a small amount of what he actually owned. That is nearly $1 billion. So think of somebody going on a pilgrimage and giving out, literally injecting into any economy, $1 billion. Not spread out to the whole world, one area. So coming around the Nile, around the Red Sea, and coming over to Mecca, he distributed all this wealth. People said, "Oh, you're so generous! So generous! Oh, yes! I love this guy!" The problem was that when he was passing out the gold, they didn't see what the gold was actually doing. The gold was making all the gold in that area worth zilch. Very little. The reason why gold is so expensive, it's worth so much money, is because it's a rare commodity. Mansa Musa knew this. He had plenty of it over in the Mali Empire. When he came over to Europe, or to Cairo and Egypt, he knew that there was a lot there. There was a lot of gold. It was being traded there. But he injected $1 billion in our money, our type of our level of money, into that market. What happens when you inject all that in there? When there's so much gold, someone that's selling a loaf of bread says, "Well, I don't need all this gold." Sorry, not that I don't need it. That gold is everywhere. It's not a rare commodity anymore. So if you're going to buy my loaf of bread, you're going to pay me 10 times as much gold for that loaf of bread. And it wasn't the market. It's the fact that everything increased in price as gold decreased. When there's more gold in that area and there was no increase in commodities, all of a sudden the value of the gold tanked. And so, say a dollar became worth a penny. And this happens all across the world. All of a sudden, you can't buy a loaf of bread unless you're going to pay them 10 times as much. So, yeah, this is a problem. And what does it do? So if we go to the map, I want to show you some of these things. Let's see. I'm going to bring up the map. This is the map of Africa. Okay, come into Africa. Mansa Musa came from the Mali Empire and came east through the Sahara Desert, which was probably mostly Sahara Desert by then, into Egypt, down through Saudi Arabia, into Mecca. He distributed all this gold. By the time he came back, it happened this fast. By the time he came back, maybe a month later, maybe a few weeks later, people were hating him. They were trying to get rid of the gold that was there. Now, gold was still a commodity. They still traded in it, but it wasn't worth anything. People were hurting. Those that didn't receive the gold, his generous offerings when he came through, didn't have gold to pay for the bread anymore. Inflation had skyrocketed. And then he went back into Mali. Now, what would have happened? What would have been better for him? Maybe to try to accumulate back the gold that he put into the system? Yeah, didn't happen. But what was so brilliant about it? Well, all of a sudden, Egypt, gold was worth very little. Egypt traded with Ethiopia. Gold was worth very little at that time. There was so much gold. What happened to the Swahili people? Gold was worth very little at that time. Now, each of these traded more than just that. But you come down to Zimbabwe, and you go to the Great Zimbabwe. That nation was destroyed. Gold was one of their biggest commodities. They had no one had any reason for gold. It was gold and ivory. Well, you can still have ivory and trade that. But if your largest commodity was gold, nobody wanted to trade with you. You didn't have what they wanted. I mean, yes, they wanted ivory, but you weren't going to kill enough elephants in that area to get enough ivory to sell to them. So all of a sudden, that civilization broke up, the city broke up, and they all trickled into different tribes of their own. That happened in other nations as well, all around Africa. It didn't just affect one, it affected the whole entire continent on the eastern side. Now, the other side, what did Mali still have? They had salt, and they had other commodities, especially slaves. What happened with slaves? They were still trading in slaves. Zimbabwe did not trade in slaves. They didn't want slaves. They didn't want bondage down there. And so what happens? They could sell ivory. That was basically it. So they were either forced to do slavery, which they did not agree with. They weren't actually a Muslim nation. The Swahili people, they actually converted a lot. A lot of them converted. Ethiopia, a lot of them converted. Interesting enough, a lot of these were actually Christian nations, or at least had Christianity in their nations. So all of a sudden, because of that, Mali started getting a lot of their gold back and was able to collect more of the gold until it was completely distributed and the value started to increase again. Well, so what happened? Well, the Mali Empire, very centralized, the other nations didn't like it. It began to break up. And then something new happened. What happened? Let's bring them back in. The next one to grow up, to develop, was the Songhai Empire. Also another Muslim-run empire. Going in with a lot more trade routes. Check out these trade routes. Okay, so somewhat simple, a lot more expansive, very expansive. The complexity of these markets were huge. And again, there's a lot of commodities in the west of Africa, and the Songhai basically controlled it as the hub of all trade in Western Africa. Much like Istanbul would have been for Europe when the traders didn't go further in. So the Songhai, you're going to have to read more about it because I'm out of time. The Songhai was important to learn about. They're in the curriculum. Learn more from there. I have one more that I want to focus on very quickly. That is the Carthage Empire. Now, going back to the map, look at this map, and then look at this map. They controlled all of northern Africa, from Morocco all the way to Egypt, basically the whole coastline. And in Tunisia is where Carthage mainly was. So here in Carthage, these were actually Phoenicians that came over from places like Greece and this area over here. They traveled down and set up shop, basically controlling the Mediterranean from the south of the Mediterranean. This was amazing. This was an empire that was very long and expansive, but because they controlled trade, being all the ships that came through the Mediterranean, they were very well accepted for some time. Now, this was actually like 300 years before, so 300 years BC, until around the time of the Romans. And actually, they went further than that, but the Golden Age. But what happened when the Romans came in? So again, this is before the Muslim traders. These were the traders that were precursors to the Muslim traders. What happened? So we're going to talk about this when we do Rome. But the Romans were very much competitors to the Carthage, to Carthage. And so there was a lot of fighting between them. So much that at one point, Carthage sent an army up through Spain to attack Rome. Now, why did they do that? Because there wasn't enough ships to bring an army through there. So they brought the whole army with them around the tip, over the Iberian, in through the straits, and I'm trying to remember, of Gibraltar, that's what it was. So through those straits, across into Spain, through Andorra, and into Roman Empire, and into the Roman Empire, and they began to attack them. Now, if you know about the Punic Wars, they lost. They lost quite dramatically, and so started to run away. Well, the Romans, they said, hey, we got an upper hand. Let's go get them. So they actually came in and attacked them into Africa. And that was the Second Punic War. So we're going to go more into that during the Roman Empire when we go over Rome. Next month, we'll be actually going into specifically Egypt and Ethiopia. Other ones, I lost my train of thought when it comes to the other groups that were there. But this is an essential one because this is one of the largest empires for the longest span of time. And still stands today. Not what it was before, but still basically Egypt stands today. So we're going to go over this. This is an essential one to learn about. Can't wait to talk to you about it next week. Let's see, next week? No, 2 to 3 weeks from now. But stay tuned for that. We're going to go to Egypt. We're going to go to Israel. We're going to go to the Middle East with the, not the Byzantines, the Mesopotamians and the Persians. We're going to go to Greece. We're going to go to Rome. We're going to then talk about China and India. We're not going to have all of them covered. We're going to cover the ones that we have. So stay tuned for more. Excited to talk to you about this. I hope you enjoyed today. This is one of the most fascinating times. This is why everyone in the United States needs to know about Africa. And remember, the slave trade, we talk about it here in the United States. But most of the people that talk about the United States, talk about the things in the United States, have no idea about African history, where it all came from, what is the origins of this. And actually, one more thing that I need to mention about the Songhai is, and we're going to talk more next week when we talk about Swahili, but they were creating raids on the smaller tribes and imprisoning the people there. Why did they do that? Again, for trade. And this is, Mansa Musa was in power around 1342 or such. When it came to the Songhai was in the late 1300s and all the way into when the Europeans came down. And they were some of the biggest instigators of these raids and taking slaves and selling them on the market. And then also using the Christian slaves as well. And actually those of Carthage actually did it as well. They provided for some of those white slaves. The Berbers as well, we may not go over them, but look them up. They're also a great understanding. I think we talk about them when we go into Egypt. So stay tuned for that. Again, thank you so much for joining me on this Adventure Box podcast, and we will catch you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. How do you turn this thing off? There it is. Okay, bye-bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.